Welcome to our inaugural broadcast of Fringe Concerns, episode 101, where we examine remote controlled cells through nanotechnology. And isn't that great? Here we go. A little technical difficulty there, as is often the case. And so, up in the right hand corner of my screen, you're going to see um, a U.S. patent number. U.S. patent 10,786,572B2. And that patent is connected to two employees, two professors, research scientists of Rockefeller University in New York. On top is Sarah Stanley, and on bottom is, let's see, I want to make sure I get his name correct, Jeffrey Friedman. Jeffrey Friedman and Sarah Stanley are the two individuals who invented this technology, which is tentatively titled Ferritin Nanoparticle Compositions and Methods to Modulate Cell Activity. I'm sure they'll come up with a fancier name for it later, but the assignee is Rockefeller University. And it provides, I'm reading from the abstract, the present invention provides methods and compositions for the remote control of cell function based on radiofrequency waves to excite nanoparticles targeted to specific cell types. The nanoparticles may be applied to the target cell extracellularly and or expressed intracellularly. The cell type of interest expresses a temperature-sensitive channel wherein excitation of the nanoparticles results in a localized temperature increase that is transduced into a cellular response. Such cellular responses may include, for example, increases in gene expression resulting in the production of one or more physiologically active proteins. The expression of such proteins can be used to treat a variety of different inherited or acquired diseases or disorders in a subject. Accordingly, the invention provides a generic approach for treatment of any disease associated with a protein deficiency. So what they're basically saying is they will apply nanoparticles of any type into your body to target cells related to function, such as insulin production. Say your pancreas don't work, they only produce proinsulin, which is the precursor to calcium-dependent insulin, and has about 10% of the efficacy of its later precursors that it turns into as it is metabolized and it undergoes a transformation into the type of insulin your body can actually use to lower your glucose levels. It seems like a novel technology. It's not at all what the internet is making it out to be in terms of remote controlling people. What it's being used to do is remote control your cells related to particular protein expression. So if you have a disease that is related to a protein deficiency, or if your body's proinsulin isn't metabolizing or changing into the type of insulin that can be used to lower blood glucose, this technology would potentially be of interest to you because through the nanoparticles and through a radio frequency application that increases or excites the nanoparticles and raises temperatures, you could theoretically cause the cell to respond to the increased heat in order to result in a gene expression that in turn produces one or more physiologically active proteins. So if you want to see the actual patent application, the patent itself, it's freely available on the internet. All you have to do is Google what's in the upper right hand corner of my screen, and it will lead you to that patent on Google Patents, in which you will be able to read it. Now, you as a layperson probably will not be able to understand exactly what's going on here. It is written in technical jargon. So I, as someone who started out as a science major, will decode it for you. So they're talking about iron oxide nanoparticles, not graphene, which we'll get into later, but iron oxide nanoparticles will be heated via a radiofrequency magnetic field. The bulk heating effects of treating the iron oxide nanoparticle suspensions in water can be calculated to be 19.83 plus 27 from 450 particles. So ultimately, it raises the temperature. It doesn't tell you exactly how much, but it does tell you that the radio frequency will be 13.56 megahertz, 200 watts, basically a radio frequency magnetic field. And it will raise the temperature of these iron oxide nanoparticles that are applied to your cells, either intracellularly. Somehow they intend to induce the production of iron oxide nanoparticles in your cell. That's the rough summation of it. Or extracellularly, on the outside of the cell, they'll be targeting certain channels that will theoretically result in the genetic expression of cellular behavior that induces the production of proteins. So, they tried this in a petri dish. What they're aiming at is temperature-dependent release of proinsulin. So, proinsulin is what your body produces before it becomes actual insulin. And they're looking to raise the level of proinsulin in cells, in particular HEK293 T cells. So they're looking at 32 degrees Celsius. They get specific about the temperature below the threshold for TRPV1 activation. That is the gene that is going to that's going to result in the expression. So, and at 44 degrees Celsius, above the threshold for the activation. So the expression of these proteins, that is the TRPV1 and TRVP1, it's a variant that has HIS at the end of it. It significantly increased proinsulin release at 44 degrees Celsius compared to that from cells without TRPV1. So, ultimately, they have induced, in an experimental or laboratory condition, an increased proinsulin response. So what you're seeing on the internet is, they want to use these nanoparticles to remote control you. Well, that's not exactly true. What they're doing is using radio frequency waves to raise the heat or excite these nanoparticles, these iron oxide nanoparticles, in order to create a cellular response that results in increased proinsulin response. Now, for the conspiratorial side, let's say you want to induce a fatal response, and you want to increase someone's insulin levels to a fatal level. You want to induce hypoglycemia that causes irreversible brain damage and/or fatal arrhythmias. You could do that. Klaus von Bülow, if you've ever seen the movie with Jeremy Irons, and if you've ever read the book Reversal of Fortune, which details Alan Dershowitz's representation of Klaus von Bülow for the alleged murder of his wife Sonny von Bülow through insulin poisoning. Klaus von Bülow was allegedly administering insulin to his wife Sonny to induce severe hypoglycemia, which in turn caused her to die. You could theoretically do that with this technology. Absolutely. I mean, you are creating high levels of insulin. You could potentially induce hypoglycemia that is severe enough to kill somebody. That's the sinister application of this technology. Now, even more sinister is the fact that in the COVID vaccine era, that is before everybody realized COVID vaccines weren't vaccines at all, but mRNA therapies that roughly 5.5 billion people on the planet received at least one dose of. Um, those vaccines were theorized in advance. At the same time, there were papers that were issued by scientists that were talking about the potential of graphene-based materials, that is, theoretically little nanotechnology graphene sheets, to combat COVID-19. So, Srivastava, Dwivedi, Dand, Khan, Satish, Gupta, Kumar, and Kumar wrote a paper that was published, and its exact title was "The Potential of Graphene-Based Materials to Combat COVID-19: Properties, Perspectives, and Prospects." And they were talking at the time, no medicine or vaccine available for COVID-19 treatment. That's their abstract. At the time that this was published, in October 21st, 2020, there was no treatment available. No medicine available for COVID-19 treatment. So they were urging the creation of smart materials or nanotechnology to design effective systems for combating COVID-19. And they specifically referenced graphene and graphene-related materials, which exhibit extraordinary physicochemical, electrical, optical, antiviral, antimicrobial, and other fascinating properties that warrant them as potential candidates for designing and development of high-performance components and devices designed or required for COVID-19 pandemic and other futuristic calamities. In this article, we discuss the potential of graphene and graphene-related materials for healthcare applications and how they may contribute to fighting against COVID-19. So they were advocating for you to be injected potentially with graphene. And in a little geographical abstract that they included beneath their written abstract, they were talking about graphene. It's all of its properties. It is antimicrobial and antiviral. You could use it for electrochemical biosensors. You could use it for piezoelectric biosensors. Any number of ways that you could get this into the human body that would be potentially beneficial in the fight against COVID-19, according to these individual scientists. So they were talking about graphene-based materials to combat viral disease and virus spread, the properties of graphene-based materials for healthcare applications, various graphene-based biosensor technologies for the diagnosis of viruses, graphene-based nanofoams and 3D printed components for protective equipments, and graphene-based antiviral surfaces coatings for high-touch surfaces. So they don't necessarily go into injecting people with graphene. They're really talking about coating surfaces with graphene that are high-touch surfaces such as doors, door handles, so on and so forth. And then, of course, there's a follow-up paper that appears in, 2021 in Current Research in Pharmacology and Drug Discovery, and it's titled, "Can the Application of Graphene Oxide Contribute to the Fight Against COVID-19, Antiviral Activity, Diagnosis, and Prevention?" So, in the abstract, they said, in this situation, the only solution to combat COVID-19 is to accelerate the development of antiviral drugs and vaccines to mitigate the virus and develop better antiviral methods and excellent diagnostic and prevention techniques. With the development of nanotechnology, nanoparticles are being introduced to control COVID-19. Graphene oxide, an oxidized derivative of graphene, is currently being used in the medical field to treat certain diseases such as cancer. It is characterized by very important antiviral activity or properties that allow its use in treating certain infectious diseases. The graphene oxide antiviral mechanism is discussed by the virus inactivation and or the host cell receptor and or by the physicochemical destruction of viral species. So theoretically, they believe that graphene oxide as a nanotechnology would enable the physicochemical destruction of viral species such as COVID-19, or it would inactivate the virus. And the problem is that later on, there was an actual paper published in Almeria, Spain, by Dr. Pablo Compra, who was at the University of Madrid. He was an associate university professor, PhD in chemical sciences, and he wrote a paper entitled Detection of Graphene in COVID-19 Vaccines by Micro-Raman Spectroscopy. That paper was published in November 2nd, 2021, as billions of people were being injected with the COVID-19 vaccines. Now, in his summary at the front of his paper, he talked about the presence of graphene in COVID vaccines. So they had carried out a random screening of graphene-like nanoparticles visible at the optical microscopy in 7 random samples of vials from 4 different trademarks. So that would mean potentially that the mRNA therapies from Pfizer, Moderna, those were part of this, 4 different trademarks. Potentially Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca were also included. Those would be the 4 that were most popular in America. By this technique called micro-Raman, we have been able to determine the presence of graphene in these samples after screening more than 110 objects selected for their graphene-like appearance under optical microscopy. Out of them, a group of 28 objects have been selected due to compatibility of both images and spectra with the presence of graphene derivatives. So, they selected 110 objects because those look like graphene. Out of their sampling of 7 random samples of vials, so different batches of these vaccines from 4 different trademarks, they found 110 objects that looked like graphene. 28 of those 110 objects were selected because they were compatible with the presence of graphene derivatives based on the correspondence of these signals with those obtained from standards and scientific literature. So they were taking the already pre-existing standards from scientific literature that would lead you to identify such objects as graphene, and they were applying those standards to those 28 objects. The identification of graphene oxide structures can be regarded as conclusive in 8 out of the 28 due to the high spectral correlation with the standard. So, they were taking their spectroscopy and applying it, and they were comparing their results to the standards in the scientific literature to be valid in terms of their findings. And they found that 8 out of the 28 were absolutely, conclusively graphene. Now, the remaining 20 objects show a very high level of compatibility with undetermined graphene structures, however different than the standard use here. So these are unclassified graphene structures. They look a lot like graphene. They show a high degree of compatibility with the standard, but they aren't exact at that moment. So, at the conclusion of the abstract, Dr. Campra makes an appeal for independent researchers with no conflict of interest or coaction from any institution to make wider counter-analysis of these products to achieve a more detailed knowledge of the composition and potential health risk of these experimental drugs. That's what he calls them because that's what the COVID mRNA therapies were. That's what the Johnson & Johnson AstraZeneca vaccines were. They may not have been mRNA therapies, but they were experimental use authorization drugs and therefore experimental in their entirety. He also notes that graphene materials have a potential toxicity on human beings. Not a potential, demonstrated toxicity. And its presence has not been declared in any emergency use authorization. So in none of the emergency use authorizations issued by the FDA or any other public health institution, in none of the emergency use authorization applications by manufacturers of these vaccines was graphene declared as a component of the vaccines. So leaves the question, how did graphene get into 28 objects, 110 objects across 7 random samples of vials from 4 different trademarks? Because it seems to be present across all of the random samples, even though it wasn't declared in any emergency use authorization. So let's talk about what graphene can do. Let's talk about its risk. So the danger of graphene, and we know this through the manufacture of graphene, is that if you are manufacturing graphene in a facility, you have to wear respiratory protection because it is lethal to humans. It creates cytotoxicity. So what it does is it interacts with cell membranes. It causes physical destruction and oxidative stress, which can lead to cell death. It can accumulate in your organs, including the lungs, liver, spleen, and kidneys. A high exposure to certain graphene oxide materials, and granted, this isn't graphene, this is graphene oxide, which is what they found in that study at the University of Madrid. It can cause acute allergic reactions, anaphylaxis. It can enter the circulatory system and accumulate in the key organs, including the lungs, liver, spleen, and kidneys. It can also trigger DNA damage, which can lead to long-term effects which are harmful. It is also a potential carcinogen. There is research that suggests that graphene may promote tumor growth. Now, if you modify the surface of graphene by making it more hydrophilic, that can reduce the toxicity, but there is no evidence that that was done here. Sharp-edged graphene sheets cause more damage to bacterial and cellular membranes. So, what we have here is the presence of graphene in the COVID-19 vaccines across all 4 trademarks that were examined. And there were 7 random samples of vials from 4 different trademarks used in this study. And it showed up in all of these. It was present even though it wasn't disclosed in any emergency use authorization. So for the 5.5 billion people across the world who received at least one injection of these mRNA therapies, and of course the alternative therapies by Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, graphene was present in all of them. And so with the Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine, they used a different technology. It was a viral vector vaccine. As of May, June 2023, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is no longer available in the U.S. because it had concerns over blood clotting issues, and its emergency use authorization expired. And of course, public health officials preferred the mRNA vaccine. So let's take a look at that. It says on Google, the AI overview is that it produces a harmless spike protein. Well, we all know that's bullshit. Spike proteins are never harmless. And given the increase in all-cause mortality across the world, given the increase in myocarditis, even among age groups that typically did not suffer from myocarditis, there are 5-year-olds who are having heart inflammation, myocarditis. There is a spike in rare cancers related to this. The presence of graphene seems to overlap with a lot of the health issues that people who receive those mRNA therapies have suffered. So, we know that it's cytotoxic. We know that it causes cell damage. We know that it accumulates in the organs, and we know that it wasn't disclosed. And we know that there are active patents that are using iron oxide, in the case of the patent being referenced above here, US 10,786,570B2, which are using nanotechnology and radiofrequency application to that nanotechnology, that iron oxide that is being administered to subjects so that their cells can be induced through heat to engage in a genetic expression that produces certain proteins or certain outcomes, such as the increase of proinsulin to treat diabetes and any other sugar-related disease. What you're looking at here is the possibility that this technology could be misused and that they aren't disclosing the full effects of this technology. It is a patented technology. Now, you'd have to go through human trials with it, but if they accelerate the human trials the way that they did with the mRNA therapies in COVID and with the viral vector vaccine that Johnson & Johnson produced, you are potentially looking at yet another disaster. The use of nanotechnologies in public health, in disease, or in fighting disease, it's a novel technology. If it works, it's great. But if it doesn't work, you have what we currently have. You have a number of people who are going to be permanently disabled. You have a number of people who are going to die as a result of myocarditis and cancers, turbo cancers, so on and so forth. And you're going to see that these nanotechnologies, which are almost always based in some sort of oxide, whether it's graphene oxide, iron oxide, or any other chemical substance, those technologies have side effects and potential risk that we don't know about. We have no idea what these people are actually going to do to us. Additionally, what we have seen from our elites is it's quite clear that they hate us. The terms that they have used to describe the majority of the human population are useless eaters. They've talked about using bug protein, not that it is necessary for the good of the human species, for them to transition us to bug protein, which they're already doing. I mean, cricket protein is already in a lot of processed foods. A let's talk about what you can find on the label. So, if you were to look at it, it would be acheta protein. That is acheta protein. It's made from ground crickets. The selling points are it contains all 9 essential amino acids, along with high levels of B12, iron, and fiber. It appears at this juncture to be safe. Crickets themselves are 60% protein, or 65% protein. So if you mill them down to a flour or a powder, you get acheta protein. Many of you, if you aren't paying attention to your food labels, have already eaten bugs. You're already doing it. It's already being rolled out. And it is sold under the guise of requiring drastically fewer resources to farm than livestock, needing 15 times less land, and significantly less feed and water to produce 1 kilogram of protein. So, of course, many of our elites are what I call neo-Malthusians. They believe that the sky is falling and they are chicken little. They formed all these groups like the World Economic Forum, so on and so forth, in order to advance this notion that global warming is the thing. It isn't. And it highlights the problem that we as ordinary consumers and ordinary citizens face, and that is that science really isn't science. Science suffers from the same thing that our regulators suffer from. You've heard the term regulatory capture, which is the corporations that a regulatory agent is supposed to regulate or oversee or investigate. Those corporations capture the regulator's employees through gifts, through outright bribes. They also engage in regulatory capture because they control the legislation regulating their industries. And they do that through political donations. In the United States, under 2% of the population funds a plurality of the donations that fund political campaigns. So if you go to Open Secrets, you're going to find out what percentage of the population funds political elections. So, roughly 1.05, that is 1.05% of the U.S. population, approximately 3.46 million people in a population of almost 350 million, contributed more than $200 to federal candidates, parties, or PACs. They provided 78.45% of all contributions to political candidates and political campaigns. So 3.46 million people fund 78.45% of all political contributions. And those same 3.45 million people, as shareholders and as executives or C-suite residents in our major corporations, they fund the scientific research, the supposedly scientific research that occurs across all of our medical schools, all of our research scientists across the United States, universities, colleges, private foundations. They are the ones funding that, and they expect a return on their investment. And so, what you're seeing is regulatory capture, you're seeing scientific capture, you're seeing a very small portion of the population that firmly believes in things like global warming. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but they are promoting this, and they're promoting this chicken little idea that the sky is falling. And if we don't do something now, we're going to run into all sorts of geopolitical problems and all sorts of humanitarian problems in the next 10 to 20 years. And of course, the next 10 to 20 years passes. The drastic consequences that they have predicted do not come to pass. And so there's an example of this is Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich published a book called The Population Bomb, in which he predicted that the world would undergo famine and resource depletion as a result of unchecked population growth. And he gave a timeline that in the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. And this was a man whose scientific expertise was in monitoring butterfly populations. I kid you not, you can look it up. So in the 1970s, these things did not occur. The issue here is that population growth was in decline, but even though his predictions were largely incorrect, I think he predicted an ice age, and then he switched to global warming as time went on. Even though his predictions were incorrect, he doubled down. So his scientific credibility should have been on the outs, just based on the fact that his predictions didn't come true, and also on the fact that this was not his area of expertise. Climatology, populations, social science, these were not his areas. These were not his areas of expertise. It was not his area of specialization. So he had pinned the apex of his widespread famine at 1985. That didn't happen. And instead of being, embarrassed, instead of receding into, obscurity, Ehrlich continued to say that the human population was too large. And that's a result. That's a problem for Ehrlich and for other neo-Malthusians, many of whom are in our elites and many of whom fund our elections and our scientific research, because they believe on faith that the population is too large, and they are actively trying to find ways to reduce that population. We've all read the articles about Bill Gates, piggybacking contraceptive onto the back of public health treatments in Africa. And that contraceptive caused African women to miscarry. It caused them to become sterile. He did the same thing in India. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Because there is a fundamental conceit among our elites that these sorts of technologies are a possible backdoor to reduce the human population, which they view as problematic. And the issue with that is we make more than enough food to feed every human being on this planet. Agriculture has evolved to a point where everyone could be fed. The issue, the reason why they aren't being fed, is because certain human beings make supply chains impossible, and they make it impossible through war over their localized power over certain populations, through hoarding of resources, so on and so forth. All of these problems are human created, as are the solutions to these problems. And the solution to the problem here is people have to eat, and therefore food should be available to them. So if I sit there and Google, we produce more than enough food to feed everyone, at the moment, we produce enough calories to feed roughly 10 to 15 billion people. That means there's no excuse for the 9% of humanity that goes hungry due to poverty, conflict, and poor distribution. So we currently produce over 1.5 times the amount of food needed to provide a sufficient diet for the global population, which is a direct rebuttal to the idea that there's not enough food or not enough resources to sustain the population. Actually, the reason people don't get food is because of what you're seeing in the Gaza Strip. You're seeing Israeli soldiers destroy food aid that is intended for the destitute population of the Gaza Strip. They are deliberately starving them. And that's the uncomfortable truth of our human situation. That's the uncomfortable truth of our elites, is that they create problems such as the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and the enabling of Israel's genocide and the United States' genocides throughout the world. They create those problems in order to promote their solutions. And when it comes to these nanotechnologies, the risks are not that they will remote control you as a human being. The risks are that they will administer things to you without your informed consent as to the consequences of these therapies, which is what they did with COVID. And what we're continuing to see with COVID is a rise in miscarriages, a rise in cancers, a rise in all-cause mortalities, and we're seeing a reduction in birth rates below the level needed to sustain the population. It is a loss of population or a reduction of population that is going to create a number of social problems for us going forward. We aren't having enough children worldwide to sustain the systems that we currently have. In the United States, the most obvious examples of this are entitlements, which rely on a current workforce. So the money for Social Security goes in the front door and immediately out the back door to pay benefits to current beneficiaries. There is no Social Security trust fund. There are IOUs in the form of U.S. Treasuries, which again rely on current workers who are taxpayers to sustain the interest that is being paid on those treasuries. And if you're reducing the current population, you aren't generating enough workers to pay the benefits to those beneficiaries who are out of the workforce. This, in all likelihood, is going to create a level of social unrest as time goes on. It's going to create a level of social disorder. So if you are interfering with the ability of people to reproduce through mRNA vaccines or through nanotechnologies that appear novel on the surface but have a hidden effect of, well, reducing the population in accordance with the neo-Malthusian view that there are too many people on the earth, guess what? You are going to create the social unrest and the social disorder that is ultimately the catalyst for the elites, the neo-Malthusians, people in the World Economic Forum and elsewhere to say, hey, we need a different way of doing business. And that means we have to have 15-minute cities. It means some of you can't travel abroad or even outside of your cities. That's why we have virtual reality. So that while you can't physically leave your 15-minute city that you're hemmed in with, you can go to Bora Bora virtually in the metaverse. And the problem with this is people aren't necessarily going to go for that idea, which leads me to the social credit system. A lot of Americans don't know that before the 1980s, we didn't have a FICO score. We didn't have a credit score. And they don't know that in places like Europe, there are no FICO scores. You don't apply for and receive credit based on a FICO score, a credit score. A lot of Americans like to believe that we don't have a social credit system now. Well, we do. We have had since the 1980s. We have it in the form of an actual credit score, which measures our debt to income ratio and determines whether or not we're able to receive a loan for a home or whether or not we're able to get a revolving credit account, that is, a credit card. Everything. So the United States economy is built on debt. It's built around consumer debt because most people don't make enough money to buy extra consumer goods. Their salaries have stagnated or declined either through inflation or through just they're not receiving any benefits of the increased productivity of their companies. Over time, executive salaries have skyrocketed, and it is no accident that many of those executives are the ones who fund groups like the WEF and the Aspen Club, so on and so forth. They're the ones who fund all of these neo-Malthusian NGOs and groups that advocate for population reduction because the problem is, as they perceive it, a larger population means more potential variables that they cannot control and more potential challenges to their authority. So they own your media, they own your medical establishment, they own your political establishment, and therefore your government. They own your universities. They own everything. All the channels, instrumentalities of information and commerce, they own it. The top 10% of the population owns 90% of the stock market. That's the reality. And that's not accidental. That's a result of government policies that enabled certain groups to benefit disproportionately from other groups. And as a result, wealth was consolidated upwards, and their influence over our politics, over our scientific research, over every aspect of our lives increased over time until our reality as ordinary people became more and more dystopian. And when you see these nanotechnologies, the issue isn't remote control of you through your cellular function. The issue is that you're already remote controlled. You're already remote controlled through popular entertainment and culture and a news media that gets you stirred up over things that really don't have any relevance to you. A media that force feeds you news that isn't news, celebrity news. Whatever is going on in the Kardashians' life, it has zero implications for you. It doesn't. It's brain rot. It's why I don't watch a lot of television, if ever, is because it is designed to make you dumber. You're already being remote controlled, not through nanotechnology that impacts your cellular function, but through every aspect of your life and the information that you absorb. And the answer is to turn off the television. The answer is to turn off the radio. The answer is to think critically about what they're putting in front of you on social media and why your reels are getting shorter and shorter, your videos, because what they're doing is conditioning you to not have the capacity, the attention span, or the cognitive ability to examine or think critically about bigger issues. They are trying to make you dumber. And they're trying to make you more immoral and more corrupt and more amenable to deviant sexual behavior. They're trying to reach your kids in public schools, which increasingly fail miserably at educating your kids about reading, writing, and arithmetic. Hence, under 50% of children are proficient or at grade level in certain subject areas across standardized tests. That's a reality. But your child can tell you that Black Lives Matter and that it's okay to be gay, and they can tell you the latest in the LMNOP acronym system and what it means. Because what the elites are indoctrinating your child into is the LMNOP paradigm, because ultimately homosexuals don't reproduce. lesbians, gay men, they don't reproduce. They've also put a stigma on reproduction among heterosexuals. They've made it prohibitively expensive for you to raise a child and to maintain a standard of living commensurate with what it takes to successfully raise a child, to feed a child, to clothe a child, to shelter a child, to educate a child. They are limiting your economic options. They're limiting your opportunities. There's this myth of scarcity of labor in the United States, and it's an outright lie. We have more than enough qualified software engineers and STEM employees in the United States who are here legally, who are citizens and permanent residents. We have more than enough of those. The problem is that their employers want to undercut them by importing cheap foreign labor through H-1B visas. Tolerating this is a form of economic and social suicide. But what the elites anticipate is that just like every other catastrophe that they create, whether economic or medical or social, they're going to be in a position to benefit and control the solution that's implemented to that. And what I'm telling you here, and what Fringe Concerns was founded to do, is to wake you up to the fact that this isn't a fringe concern. These nanotechnologies, they are going to have real health effects. They're already having real health effects for the 5.5 billion people who received at least one dose of the mRNA therapies, which were a giant experiment on humanity. And it's been conclusively demonstrated that those mRNA therapies have graphene in them, which was not disclosed on any emergency use authorization. And what you're seeing in this iron oxide nanotherapy referenced in this patent here, which has gone viral across the internet, is we know that they don't disclose the full story or the full risk. There's no reason to trust our public health institutions because they betrayed that trust during COVID. They betrayed it before, but COVID is the most glaring example of their abdication of credibility. At the end of the day, a lot of the problems that are in the world are created by these neo-Malthusian elites who have one objective, and that is to reduce the human population and make it more manageable. It's not that we don't have enough resources to feed everyone, or to clothe everyone, or to shelter everyone. It's that those resources are currently being directed and controlled by people who want to kill you. They want you to miscarry your child. They want you to be infertile and sterile. And what we see are the social contagions that they create in the aftermath of things like Roe versus Wade being overturned. In the aftermath of that, we've seen more abortions than ever. In the aftermath of that, we've seen people voluntarily undergoing vasectomies and voluntarily undergoing tubal ligations to self-sterilize themselves because they can't have an abortion legally. That was the social contagion and the social panic that the elites created through the media, which they own and control. 6 major corporations control everything that you watch and hear through your media. You can read The Media Monopoly by Ben Bagdikian. It's gone through multiple editions and multiple reprints. And it demonstrates conclusively consolidation of the media and the effects of that. And as you read books like that, as you read news like that, it ultimately is the antidote to social contagion and social panic. It enables you to think critically about what's going on around you and why these people are feeding you the content that they feed you. The reason they want you to watch pornography and be addicted to pornography is because people who expend their generative energy or their procreative energy on pornography don't form the social connections necessary to form relationships, or they harm their existing relationships by diverting their energy and focus away from the person that they're with to pornography. It creates social alienation, so on and so forth. And the reason that they have pushed it so hard is because it is destructive to human relationships, which are conducive to human procreation. And as a result, they are achieving the world which they want to live in. Population is declining. It's not declining fast enough for their preferences, but it is declining. And one of the things that you need to understand is that people like Bill Gates, they're not motivated by altruism. They are motivated by hatred of you as an ordinary person, and they think that you're stupid. And the antidote to that is to not be stupid. The antidote to that is to read and to consume informative content as opposed to celebrity news. Now, it is my hope that this isn't falling on deaf ears. It's my hope that when you watch this or you read any of the content on Fringe Concerns or sites like Investigations in Ritual Abuse, Alien or Sedition Media's plethora of sites, such as anti-tribe and government sex predators and church sex predators, Investigations of Ritual Abuse and Fringe Concerns, that ultimately you will be stimulated and informed, but also empowered with the information you need to act. None of this is useful if you don't mobilize, if you don't start organizing at the level of your community to affect policy changes in your community. It's useless if you don't start getting involved politically. And I know most of us hate politics. We hate both major parties. But those are the options that we have, short of a violent revolution. And those of us who have been shot at or have ever had to do physical or mortal harm to somebody would caution you, revolutions are not romantic. Revolutions have real human cost. And while you may win in the end, a significant number of people are going to lose. So when you read all of the hysteria on social media about this patent, 10,786,570B2, and how they're going to remote control you, ultimately it is bullshit. It's intended to get you upset. Yes, they will engage in what could be typified as remote control of your cellular function through nanotechnology, ostensibly because it might help you if you're diabetic or if you have a disease or a condition rooted in protein deficiency. It might seem like a wonder drug or a wonder treatment for you. But here's the thing. Our medical establishment and our public health establishment rarely discloses the full picture, and the only way to change that, the only way to keep them honest, is to get involved. And I don't mean going to vote. If voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal. I believe it was Emma Goldman who said that. I mean getting involved in terms of taking over as precinct captains for both major political parties. I mean getting involved at the county level of the Republican and Democratic Party and taking it over. I mean getting involved at the level of your state. I mean getting involved to such a degree that ultimately you are sabotaging these entities from within. The truth of the matter is, if you were, in fact, effectively mobilizing in the state of Utah, where I presently live, I put my house up for sale and I'll be moving, hopefully soon. If you were effectively mobilizing and effectively organizing, you would be following what Saul Alinsky said about organizing and its purpose. You don't organize for anything other than power. That's it. And if the Utah Republican Party had any balls, if it had any effectiveness whatsoever at the caucus level, it would have expelled people like Spencer Cox from its ranks. Spencer Cox wouldn't be a member of a Republican Party because the activists who run and control the caucus would have expelled him from the Republican Party. They would have expelled him as a member of the Republican Party. But the Utah Republican Party doesn't run its own affairs. The Utah State Legislature does, which is why you have an unconstitutional, illegal signature collection system that has become the norm. So even if Spencer Cox doesn't win at the caucus for the nomination, he just collects or forges enough signatures on a signature collection initiative to qualify for the ballot and to win outright in the primary. Just expel him. Just kick these people out of your party. But that isn't done. Spencer Cox wants to run as an independent. He can. Let's face it. The majority of his voters are the Salt Lake Democrats and Salt Lake Liberals. And the same thing for those Salt Lake Democrats and Liberals. Great. You get to pick the Republican nominee for governor. But what else do you get? Are you happy with the current state of affairs in Utah in terms of what your Democratic Party does and what it advocates for? You happy with its effectiveness? I don't think that you are. So things like this, these conspiracy theories or these fringe ideas, they are ultimately kind of a microcosm of a bigger problem. And that problem is ignorance. They do not have the capacity to control you remotely through this patent. But they do have the capacity to control you remotely through entertainment and news and ideology. And they are doing so. Because by and large, the majority of the population rarely gets what it wants. You rarely get what you vote for. If ever. Truth of the matter is, the majority of us do not want adults in a public education system talking to our child about sex and sexual identity. We don't want that, but it's still happening. We don't want our children receiving a conflicting message at their school from the one that we provide at home. Values begin in the home. They don't begin in the schoolyard or the school classroom. They begin at home. The responsibility of educators is reading, writing, and arithmetic. And they need to get in that lane and stay in that lane. That's what the majority of people want, and that's what the majority of people are paying taxes for, is for their child to be able to read, be able to do basic math and function, and also to be able to write a complete sentence or a paragraph so that they're not ignorant of how their language works. They're not ignorant of how math works in mass application to the real world in terms of using a tape measure or a ruler or calculating your taxes and balancing your household budget. These are the things that you need to be able to do in order to be able to function successfully as a human being. But those are skills that are not being passed on or imparted to our children. And at Fringe Concerns, while we do focus on fringe matters, we do so with an eye towards larger matters, the basic living conditions of ordinary human beings. That's what we're concerned with. And the reason we emphasize these very fringe, very niche areas in our content is because we want you to be aware of what's going on in your world. We want you to be aware of how it impacts you. And most of all, we want you to be motivated to do something about it, as opposed to feeling helpless about it. Here's the thing. Everything that confronts us in terms of a problem is solvable. It's all solvable. It's all fixable. It isn't being fixed because the majority of us feel hopeless to fix it. That's by design. You are inundated every day with negative content and negative news. I am telling you that the elites do want to kill you. They don't want you to reproduce. They don't want you to be happy. They don't want you to have functioning relationships or lives. They despise you. And they believe that you're the problem. And I'm saying that works to our benefit because a very small portion of the world's population needs to be addressed in order to fix our social ills and our social problems. And that very small portion of the population is easily identified because they're the ones who fund political campaigns. They're the ones who fund scientific research in order to corrupt scientific research. They're the ones who fund medical research in order to corrupt medical research so that they can sell you another pill that has more side effects than solutions. But here's the thing. This is fixable. This is solvable. Once you target a very small portion of the world's population, less than 1% of the world's population, that creates an overwhelming majority of the problems in our world. The people who consider themselves the elite. Once you confront that and you start taking back your government and your institutions from them, and you start saying no to them, they're outvoted. They're outnumbered. Who do you think makes up the military and the police in this country? Do you think it's the elites? Or do you think it's ordinary people like us who have been brainwashed? That's the question I'll leave you with. All of the mechanisms of force in this country are occupied by ordinary people who have been brainwashed into thinking that they're serving a common purpose as opposed to the exclusive purpose of an elite that wants the majority of us to die. This is Goel with Fringe Concerns, and this has been episode 101, Remote Controlled Cells, Remote Controlled Lives. I'll catch you at the next episode. Thank you for watching and thank you for reading. If you hit the like button or the subscription button, that would help us a great deal in terms of moving forward, monetizing our channel. So please do so. Thank you.